I haven't had a chance to meet all of you, so let me introduce myself. My name is Tom Wiedemann, and I can't say the brand new anymore, Executive Director at the Motor Racing Research Center, and we are delighted and honored that you've chosen to spend a beautiful Saturday afternoon with us here. I've got a number of announcements before we actually begin our program. Some of you may have been here last night. Last night we hosted a really wonderful party for the SCCA Majors, Super Majors Tour. Among the special features of that party, our archivist, Jenny Ambrose, had pulled out some of the exciting pieces from the SCCA archive collection that we're beginning to organize, and they are in a display case in the Collier Room. So let me point that out to you when you go back over. Be sure and stop into the Collier Room and take a look at that wonderful display. Today we're going to learn about the exciting 50 years of Formula One racing at the Canadian Grand Prix. And we have three speakers with years of stories to tell. In order of appearance, we're honored to be hearing from George Webster, Lionel Birnbom, and Tim Meddaugh. So let me start with George. George was a Canadian Automobile Sports Club appointee to the Stewards Committee for the Grand Prix races during the Mosport years of the early Montreal years. He was Chief Steward, chairing the Committee of Race Stewards from 1977 through 1980. He has attended 71 Formula One Grand Prix. And George is a retired high school teacher from Oakville, Ontario. He's been working part-time as motorsports writer and photographer since the mid-1970s. And he has covered road racing, NASCAR, kart, and Formula One racing for the publications, including Autosports Canada, PRN Ignition, National Speed Sport News, and the website GoRacing.com. Lionel is a self-taught photojournalist of Ottawa, and he began attending motorsports events in the late 1950s. He was widely published in most major racing magazines and papers in Canada, Road and Track, Car and Driver, and Competition Press in the US, Autosport and Motorsport, and in England, and many other hardcover, softcover racing books, including both of Pete Lyons' Can-Am books. He recently self-published The Golden Years of Motorsport in Eastern Canada and the USA, a photographic journey from the late 1950s to the 1980s. It contains more than 2,100 photos. And coincidentally, he's offering the book for sale this afternoon at the Research Center. And I just dropped my last note, so I'm going to disappear, but I'll be back. Hi, did you miss me? Okay, turning to Tim. Tim was a pit and paddock marshal as well as a flagger for 4 years of Mosport. He then worked as a flagger at every station in Montreal until his last race in 2012. Overall, he has worked at 65 Formula One races in Canada or the United States, including the first United States Grand Prix at Austin in 2012. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speakers, and we'll start with George.
So this year we're marking the 50th anniversary of the first Grand Prix of Canada. That was held at Mosport in 1967. This year is the 50th anniversary of the race. If there'd been a race every year, this would have been the 51st running, but it's actually only the 48th running because it was canceled 3 times, in 1975, 1987, and 2009. And actually, cancellation has been threatened at least twice, 2 other times that I know of. 2004, when the federal law prohibited tobacco sponsorship in the cars, completely prohibited it. And in 2017, this year, the organizers at Mosport at Montreal had promised to do about $18 million worth of upgrades and had apparently done none of them. And so that the race was under question. Now they have been given a postponement for 2 years. 2019, they're supposed to do that 18 million improvements. This year, see, I knew I wasn't going to do this, right? So there's 67. So there's this year, the graphic for this year. There I am. I got to do 2 things at once. I'll get this worked out yet. So this year, the Canadian Post Office recognized the 50th anniversary with a commemorative set of stamps honoring 5 GP winners: Jackie Stewart, Gilles Villeneuve, Ayrton Senna, Michael Schumacher, and Lewis Hamilton. All with the exception of Gilles, they were multiple winners of a Grand Prix. I think there would have been more appropriate subjects for them to recognize the Canadian Grand Prix, but I guess this is what they thought would sell. I'm not particularly enamored of the artwork. So, yeah, I'll get this right yet. So I attended the first Grand Prix at Mosport in '67, and I was at the 48th running 2 weeks ago. I attended all 8 GPs at Mosport, the next 6 in Montreal, and a few more since then. In all, I have attended over 70 Grand Prix here and in Europe. There is no, despite its European origins and identity, the Formula One Grand Prix of Canada has always been, without question, the premier auto racing event in Canada. And there's no other annual sporting event of any kind in Canada that has such an international reach. You know, what might it be? The Grey Cup, the Stanley Cup, the Brier, only Canadians would know what that is, that's curling. As for other race events in Canada, nearly all the other major auto racing events are visiting rounds of American-based series. By contrast, here in the United States, there are many annual race events which tend to overshadow the US GP, such as the Indy 500, the Daytona 500, 24 Hours of Daytona, and so on. So, 1967, 50 years ago, what do we remember? Well, here's some things that come to my mind. It was Canada's centennial year, and there's the centennial logo. We all remember Expo 67, which was staged in Montreal and on 2 islands. One, Ile Notre Dame, where the Grand Prix is held, was completely built as an artificial island completely. The other one was Ile Sainte Helene was partly built. I'm from Toronto. The Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup that year. Haven't won it since. Ronald Reagan, this is governor, inaugurated as governor of California. That's a long time ago. You probably remember that there were race riots that year in Detroit and many other U.S. cities. That's a while ago, too. The Beatles released their album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Band. In the movies, we had Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate, Clint Eastwood in the movie A Fistful of Dollars. On television, there was the Smothers Brothers. On Broadway, it was Cabaret, and Hair was still off Broadway. But in our context, perhaps more significantly, was the movie Grand Prix was released late in 1966. It was in Cinerama, which is like IMAX today, and it featured amazing in-car racing footage, unlike anything we'd ever seen before. And it introduced the general public to Grand Prix racing, the circuits, the cars, the drivers, some fictional and some real. So when the Grand Prix came to Mosport in 1967, there was already a ready-built, well-informed fan base in place. British sports cars and their more humble economy sedans were very popular, and we lusted for the more expensive makes like Porsche, Jaguar, Mercedes. This was the foundation of the so-called sports car movement, which was in Canada as well as here. The number of sports car clubs in the 50s was exploding. The Canadian Automobile Sport Clubs, or CASC, was a federation formed of member clubs across the country, especially in Ontario and Quebec. So CASC affiliated clubs that organized sports car races on the runways of former World War II air training bases beginning in the early 1950s. There were at least 5 different airfield circuits that operated in Ontario in the pre-Mosport era. We got our news from magazines like Canada Track and Traffic and Road and Track, even though their long lead times meant that the racing news was pretty stale by the time we read about it. There were weekly papers like Competition Press and Motoring News, but few Canadians read either one of those. Companies like Castrol, Shell, and BP produced racing films, which the clubs would borrow to show at their meetings, and there was very limited television coverage of car racing at that time. So the recent invasion of the Indy 500 by F1 stars like Jack Brabham, Clark, Gurney, Graham Hill, and Jackie Stewart had given these drivers much more visibility. Hence, we knew a lot about the recent history of sports car racing in Formula One, but we may not have been too up to date on the recent events of the current season. Now, I've lost track of where I'm at here. Oh, that's where with the large immigrant population, especially in Toronto and Montreal, we had a built-in fan base of post-war arrivals from Britain, Germany, and especially Italy. This is a little bit later, but it shows you the Italian fan base. Watkins Glen had been putting on the USGP here since 1961, and Mosport, there have been professional races since its beginning in 1961, the Players 200 and the Sports Car Canadian Grand Prix. And at San Jovita, as we called it then, they also ran professional sports car races. In 1966, both those circuits hosted rounds of the first year of the Can-Am series. Gerald Donaldson, who has become Canada's premier Formula One writer, wrote a definitive history of the early years of the Canadian Grand Prix, and I found this book to be a valuable resource. The photos I'm using today have been scanned from contemporary publications. Many of those photos are credited to Lionel, who you're going to hear from next. And I know he's going to be using some of the same photos I'm using in his presentation. And thanks to Bill Green for the use of his program collection, which I've made good use of. Now I've lost there we go. Okay. So by 1967, we were ready to welcome a proper Formula One Grand Prix to Canada. Early in the decade, there had been a couple unsuccessful attempts to get a Formula One race in Canada. One to be a non-championship event and one to be a championship round. But those attempts failed. So the 1967 event was approved as a one-off event in recognition of our centennial year. Both Mosport and San Jovita wanted the event, but it went to Mosport. So here's the familiar form of the track map at Mosport, that three-dimensional look. This one is actually two-dimensional and is more accurate two-dimensional plan of the track, and it's essentially the same today. So here's the starting lineup for the 67 race. There were 18 entries. There were 2 Canadians and 2 Americans in addition to Dan Gurney. That is, only 14 Formula One regulars, and few of those had proper 3-liter engines as allowed by the 1966 rules, going into 67. The new Lotus 49 with the new Cosworth Ford DFB engine had won the pole in the race in its inaugural race, the Dutch GP a few weeks earlier. This engine was to revolutionize and dominate Formula One racing for the next several years. But I doubt many people at Mosport had any concept of how significant this engine was, even though these Lotus cars proved to be the fastest in qualifying. That's the point I was making about the fact we got our news from Road and Track, which is months old, or years old sometimes. The other potential winner was the Brabham Repco, the champion car from the previous year. It's a light car with a reliable stock block V8 engine. Others like Ferrari, Maserati, and BRM had gone down the wrong track, building big, heavy, and often unreliable engines. The rest of the car entries in the main were using bored-out engine from the previous 1.5-liter rules, trying to run in a 3-liter class, or from the even older 2.5-liter rules that ended in 1960. So here's the starting grid. The 2 Lotuses who are on the front row to the left there out of frame. That's Denny Holmes, Brabham, Repco in the front there. Here's the first corner. It was a rainy day, started in the rain, note the spray. Also note that Clark is already 3 or 4 car lengths out ahead of everybody else, with Hill behind him and Hulme off to the side there. Later in the race, here's some more spray. That's Gurney leading the eventual winner, Jack Brabham. Gurney ended up lapped down, so this is probably taken at the point when he was being lapped. And bottom is Brabham, the race winner. The 2 Lotus cars were the fastest, but they had troubles in this race. Notably, the ignition shorted out when the rain came down. And the Brabhams, who were on good years, that may have been significant, had a better pace when the surface was wet. In the second half of the race, the rain came down quite heavily, and Lotuses were done for. And most of the drivers made pit stops to try to get dry goggles. Only Jack Brabham had a relatively uneventful day. He cruised home to win by a margin of more than a full minute over his teammate Denny Hulme, the only other driver to finish all 90 laps. Gurney was third, a lap down. So there's the results. There were 12 finishers, 5 DNFs. The two Brabhams ended up winning, even though we consider them to be kind of underclass cars. They had won the championship the previous year, and they were to go on to win the championship in '67 as well. The best result for a Canadian driver went to LPs, who only completed 47 laps. LPs gets a lot of bad press. I remember LPs from when I got started in the latter part of the 50s. And in Ontario, he was a really well-respected driver. He drove MGA Twin Cam, MGB, Lotus 23, and was a successful driver. I think people tend to think he was over his head with this car. It was a car that had an old four-cylinder Climax engine. I don't think it was well prepared, and I think he just had a lot of bad luck. But it's unfortunate because LP's, his name is mud when it comes to Formula One. So it may not have been a classic race by any measure, but it was our Grand Prix, and it was our first F1 Grand Prix, and that makes it iconic in the history of Canadian motorsport. Here's the trophy presentation, Brabham on the left. Note the centennial logo, of course. This is centennial year. Bob Hanna, on the extreme right, was one of the key figures among many in making this event a success, and he continued to play a key role as CASC's executive director until its unfortunate demise in 1987. In a way, as I think about this, he's sort of Canada's Cameron Argensinger. Cameron, of course, had many different important roles in the development of sports car racing in the U.S. here and Formula One. And Bob was there right through to '87 when CSC was kind of booted, and he lost that role. Fortunately, he landed on his feet with another role. So I'm going to skip from there to Montreal and do the 2 years together. Lionel's more familiar with these years than I am. So key thing was, up until then, CSC was not an ASN in its own right. We only had the right as an affiliate of the RAC in Britain, and that's why the racing colors were green like Britain's. And there was a problem for Britain to get a second Grand Prix, even if it was another continent. So after the '67 event, the FIA granted CSC full ASN status and the right to stage an annual Grand Prix. And incidentally, at the same time, CSC changed its racing colors from green with white stripes to red with a white stripe. A lot of people, because racing colors kind of went out of style in those days, a lot of people aren't even aware of that. So in this era of rapprochement between English and French communities in Canada, the decision was made to alternate the Grand Prix between Quebec and Ontario. That was happening in Britain between Brands Hatch and Silverstone, for example. So here's the first race at Saint-Jovite. It had hosted the first Can-Am race of all Can-Am races in 1966. Notice that they recycled the artwork from the year before, and the official name down at the bottom there is Circuit Mont-Tremblant Saint-Jovite. In those days, we usually spoke of going to Saint-Jovite or Le Circuit. Here's a map of the circuit. It had limited space in the paddock and the pits and limited vantage spots for the spectators. More importantly, it had a 2-lane road coming up from Montreal. Jackie Eakes was driving for Ferrari that year. He crashed in practice and broke his leg. Our Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, was a very popular Prime Minister, flew in by helicopter. I think that was exciting in itself. He waved the flag to start the race, and he stayed engaged to the end of the race. He presented as a real fan. There's the start of the race. This is the only time when the cars had the high wings in Canada. So Rint started from the pole in a Brabham Repco, but Chris Amon led the first 72 laps in his Ferrari. And the 1967 champion, Denny Hulme, starting from the third row, was the winner in McLaren Ford. And there it is there. I'm going to skip a year forward to 1970, after a year back in Mosport, where they put a picture of the new Tyrrell Ford 001. It was much anticipated, although nobody had ever seen one on a racetrack, on the cover. This is an overview that Lionel took of the pits from up Namro Corner. And you can see that we're still using the circus tents for paddock garages. George Eaton, who is a sign of the Eaton department store family, the most important department store chain in Canada by far, bought a ride with BRM for a season and a bit, but he had limited success. He finished 10th here at Saint-Jovite, and that was his best ever result. By the way, Lance Stroll's 9th place in this year's Canadian GP was the best result ever for a Canadian driver, other than the two Villeneuves, Gilles and Jacques, his son. So here's Steward in the Tyrrell, showed up at the race. He qualified in the pole. He led for the first 31 laps, and he was motoring off into the distance, says Donaldson. On lap 32, he retired with a broken front stub axle, and remember, this was the great new car. The next two races here at the Glen and at the Mexican Grand Prix, he retired as well. There's Eakes, 1980, getting that trophy. He inherited the lead after Steward retired, and he ran the race by 15-second margin over Regazzoni and the other Ferrari. Chris Amon in a March was the only other driver to finish in the lead lap. Note that here in 1977, players are still using that 1967 Centennial-based themed logo. I think the Centennial logo got pretty stale after 1967, but they're still using it. So there's a year in between, 69, and then we jumped to 71 through 77 at Mosport. So this is the 69 interstitial race at Mosport. Jackie Eakes won the pole in his Brabham Ford, while Jackie Stewart was fourth fastest in his Matra car with a Ford engine. Eakes led from the start, but Stewart had caught him by the fifth lap, and he took the lead. After that, Eakes hounded Stewart, and on lap 33 of the 90-lap race, Eakes made an impossible move to duck inside Stewart, coming over the crest into the second turn, which is, if you know Mosport at all, that's the trickiest possible corner, and nobody should try to make this maneuver, coming over the crest into two. They collided. Moss was spun off and out of the race. Not Moss, Stewart spun off and out of the race, while Eakes kept on going. Not a very popular guy. He won the race by a margin of 36 seconds over Jack Brabham in the other Brabham car. Rint in a Lotus was the only other driver to finish in the lead lap. So after this, the GP returned to Saint-Jovite in 70, and then it came back to Mosport in 71. Notice that the players still like recycling the artwork. And also notice the name, Players Grand Prix Canada. To me, that's significant because that's not English, it's not French. In French, it would be Grand Prix du Canada. I think Grand Prix du Canada Players, but it should be Grand Prix du Canada. And in English, they call it Grand Prix of Canada to try to have the parallelism. So I think this was an attempt to kind of just fudge over that. Eakes won the pole here, 1971. Jackie Stewart was, if I got this right? Yeah, Jackie Stewart was fourth fastest. This is 69. Eakes led from the start, but Stewart had caught him by lap 5. No, I've done that. I've hit the wrong button. That's what happened. Okay, this is 71, right. 71, my biggest memory was something I never saw. I was down at corner 5, and there's a driver named Wayne Kelly, who's, I guess, from the Ottawa area, who was a very popular driver and looked destined for stardom, at least within Canada. He was killed in an on-track accident during the Formula Ford race when he came over the crest between corners 1 and 2, ran into an ambulance, parked on the track, and was killed instantly. And to me, when I question, do we really need these full course yellows on a road course, this incident would be one of the major arguments early on to say we've got to do something. And the something is full course yellow. I hate those full course yellows on a road course, but I think this Wayne Kelly incident was one of the ones that is in the history of that. So there was a long delay under Ontario law. The coroner had to be dispatched, and he had to do whatever he does. So there's a long delay. And by the time we were ready to start the Grand Prix, it started raining. So then they had delay over that, but over 2 hours before the race got started. This wasn't such a big problem in the pre-television days. By lap 60 of the 80 laps, the rain had turned to fog and darkness. Darkness was approaching, so the race was flagged off after just 64 laps. Stewart and Peterson had shared the lead, but Stewart led the final 33 laps to take the checker. Peterson was second in the march, while Mark Donoghue was third. I should have shown you that. There's Stewart ahead of Peterson, and there's the three of them, Donoghue, Peterson, and Stewart on the podium. Here's my friend George Eaton again. This was his only start in 77. He finished 15th, and it was his last race with BRM, and kind of his last race ever. By this time, he'd pretty well run through his inheritance, I believe. The department store, by the way, is long since defunct, so it's not just George Eaton that's lost out, but he'd used his inheritance in racing. Maybe it was a good idea, because I guess the rest of the family just lost it through bankruptcy of the company. So some mod artwork for 72. Back at Mosport, CSC made the decision not to return to San Jovita as originally planned. It had been proved to be an unviable business proposition. Not enough spectators could get up that two-lane road on race day. And from my perspective, which was as a member of the national executive, I see that decision was essentially a CASC decision, even though most people try to blame the place to blame elsewhere. I think ultimately CASC just pulled the plug and said, we have lost a pile of money, and whether players bailed them out or whether they had to bail themselves out, but CASC was on the hook for a huge amount of money and never went back to San Jovita. So CASC found a permanent home at Mosport and came back in 72. So here, if I can get this, here's another publication that was produced, I guess, after the event. This is a driver's meeting, and I find it interesting, partly because I recognize most of the people, not just the drivers, but friends of mine are in that picture as well. And this is at the foot of the tower as you go into the control tower. That's the way, and there's anybody who wandered along could kind of cozy up at the back and listen in to the driver's meeting. Here's another picture of the same driver's meeting looking from the other direction. I find it interesting to look for people that I know. So this race was also delayed by fog. Peterson led Stewart, Stewart had started from the second row. But after just 3 laps, he got passed for the lead and drove off in the distance, and he won the race. Peterson continued to drive in his dramatic style, but he collided with Graham Hill who he was lapping, and ended his day. Peter Revson, who was a rookie that year in Formula One, finished second in a Yardley McLaren. I don't have a podium shot. Some 40 seconds back, 48 seconds back. In those days, you didn't have these half a second or 3 second gaps. 48 seconds back to second place. Hulme was third, also in McLaren. Okay, 1973. Interesting year. It was wet at the start, and I was sitting in the grandstand across from the pits as a spectator. And the thing that struck me most of all was this guy who started on the 4th row, dropped the flag, and he's gone right into the first corner. I think he led into the first corner. Niki Lauda in his second year in Formula One, first year with BRM. He did a lot better with BRM than George Eaton did. Part of it had to do with the fact they were on Firestone tires, and a lot of the others were in Goodyears, and the Firestone rain tires seemed to be superior. Now, this is the big incident. In the wake of some serious accidents, which had been inadequate rescue procedures, for example, the Roger Williamson fatality at Zandvoort earlier that year, the responsible officials have been talking about using a full course yellow in a Grand Prix for some time. And then they had actually made a test run at an earlier event in the year. But this time it actually came to pass. Scheckter and Sever tried to run side by side down into turn 2. Remember that with Eakes and Stewart? And Sever was crashed out of the race. Scheckter continued. This was to be Sever's final race. Watkins Glen people know this. 1973, Sever here was killed in practice. So he never started the race here. But this accident with the service vehicles that were out partially blocked the track, so they called out Eppie Wietz's in the pace car. Unfortunately, in that era of handmade lap charts, no one was quite sure who the leader was after most of the cars had pitted to change off their rain tires. So they told Eppie to pick up Howden Ganley, and I've lost my text here. They told Eppie to pick up Howden Ganley, who I don't know why they thought he was the leader. I think he was a lap down. So he came out in the middle of the lap. So the cars who were ahead, we all know this. If the pace car comes out in the middle of the pack, the guys who are in front come around and make up a lap, and the people who are behind are trapped. So Fittipaldi was trapped behind Ganley, and these other guys come, and they come around. But some people, and there's one person here, who claims that they knew what was going on, but the key people, who were the race control people, weren't sure or didn't know how to fix it. If you ask me afterwards, I can tell you a similar story in my kart reporting days at Homestead, where very similar kind of thing happened in the late 90s. So anyway, after the pace car was called in, the racing resumed, confusion continued. If I could get there we go. So here's the scoreboard at lap 80, the end of the race. That's Fittipaldi, number 1. Number 2 is Ganley. Number 3 is Revson. Number 4 is Beltoise. Now, understandably, Colin Chapman thought his guy had won the race. He runs out in the track, throws his hat up in the air, but there was no checker. And so the starters standing there. Finally, this group with Ganley, Halewood, Revson, and Hunt come around, and out comes the checker. And so they ushered these 3 guys, Fittipaldi, Revson, and Oliver, to the podium, and they stood there with bemused expressions on their face, and the trophy was handed to Rebs, and they finally got a new Maple Leaf trophy there. I think, what do I want to do? Yeah. So in the hours that followed, the lap scorers were able to recheck their work using the tapes that had been marked with the car numbers as they passed. It takes a few moments before the information written on the tapes is transferred to the actual lap chart. But it is an accurate, if a little bit slow, method. So in the end, after they went through some hours of double checking, triple checking, they verified that Revson was the race winner, Fittipaldi was second, and Oliver third. So it appears that when they took them to the podium, they already had a pretty good, rough version of this lap chart based on the tapes. I think there's about a maximum delay in that process of about a lap. So they knew, but nobody was going to believe them until they went and spent hours doing it. Beltoise was fourth, and Ganley was sixth, those two guys up there. So it's no surprise that in F1 they got cold feet about the pace car. This is 73, and it wasn't until 93 that they finally came back and established what we now know as the safety car procedure. And of course, computerized lap scoring had been established for a long time by then. So we all know now that the lap score, as soon as the car crosses the line, we've got it. Sometimes I find it confusing. Sometimes they are updating halfway around the lap. So here's the winner, Revson, on the cover of Motorsport. So 1974. How am I doing for time here? Okay. This is significant that we have Andretti in a Parnelli, American-made car, and Donahue in a Penske, in another American car. There's the podium with Fittipaldi, the winner, Peterson and Regazzoni. And there's a picture of the winner. He left here tied in championship points with Regazzoni, who had finished in second place. Fittipaldi finished fourth here 2 weeks later, but that was good enough to give him the title. 1975, nothing happened, but everything happened. This is in the iconic points in the history of the Canadian Grand Prix. This is one of the big ones. So there was no Grand Prix. So Bernie Ecclestone, who had come in as the owner of the Brabham team, had talked all the garages, that's basically everybody but Ferrari, into having him negotiate a collective agreement on their behalf. So he was starting to turn the screw. So he was involved in negotiations with both Mosport and Watkins Glen in August of 75, in August. And he set a deadline. This is Bernie's stuff. There's a deadline, that's it. No compromises. So I don't know what was going on, but the Mosport people dithered a little bit and didn't meet the midnight deadline. I guess it's Mel Curry here. Figured, saw what was going to happen and decided he would accept Bernie's terms. So he accepted Bernie's terms. Mosport people got up the next morning. Bernie said, well, there's going to be a Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, and there's not going to be a Grand Prix at Mosport. Tough. I think that's exactly what Bernie wanted. I think that's exactly what he wanted, because he only lost one date off the calendar, but he had an object lesson that stood for every other Grand Prix organizer he was negotiating with. You know, if do what I say or you're screwed. And I'm not going to compromise. So I think that this event in 75, when this failure for Mosport to make a deal, anybody else would have said, they come in the next morning and said, oh, sorry, we were confused. We'll sign now. Where do I sign? You know, they would have, if you're buying a car, you come in the next day and you said, yeah, I decided that was the price here. Where do I sign? He would have said, yeah, fine, you got a car. Bernie said, screw you. So because Mosport was committed to run the date and had advertised it, and they had all the sport races organized, they still ran the race, whether at the Grand Prix, and they call it the Grand Prix. Terrible weather. It was the worst, one of the worst days of weather I've seen for a race event. So we get to 76. So at the start, Peterson is leading Hunt. I was going to use this thing if I can know how to do it. Here's Jochen Moss back here. That's the car that's across the way. But notice that they've got the low airbox and not the high airbox as the car across the way has. But there's Moss back there. And in this race, in that car that you see there, this is Peterson down here. Hunt took the lead on the 9th lap and basically drove home. Gerald Donaldson wrote, Hunt won in convincing style, but there was a great interest in Niki Lauda, the leader of the World Championship, in only his second race after his near-fatal Nürburgring crash. He finished 8th between Carlos Pace, who had a wild entanglement with Clay Regazzoni in front of the pits, 3 laps from the end of the race. So I was one of the stewards for that event, and Bernie decided he was going to protest that Regazzoni had caused that crash and hurt his driver's chances and so on. So he protested. Now Bernie doesn't show up. He sends an underling. But anyway, there they are, Regazzoni and I think the guy that ran the golf team had run the golf team previously. Regazzoni only spoke Italian in the meeting, so we had to translate everything, but he sometimes would forget and answer before the question was translated. So anyway, we ruled that this was a racing incident. That it's a pretty common occurrence that you came into corner 10 and you overcook it, and it gets loose and you go wham straight into the pit wall or almost into it. Bobby Rahal later had a really big crash there in a Can-Am car in the Prophet. Anyway, we said, no, we're not going to play your game, Bernie. You deal with that. It had something to do also, I think, with who was contracted to who the following year. 77 was the final year, if I can get my clicker to work here. There's Hunt in 76. Here's the program for 77. A little fancy artwork using a negative. So 77 was the final year at Mosport. Labatt's had already made a decision to go to another venue the following year. But this 77's races, probably aside from that, I don't think there would ever have been another Grand Prix at Mosport after 77, even if they hadn't already made the decision. Because on Friday, Ian Ashley, this is his car, there's a hump, there used to be a bigger hump on the back straight, took off the back straight, and I think he got about as high as this ceiling before he landed. He landed, hit the top of a television tower, and landed. And turned out that the rescue procedures were solely lacking. The big point they made was that they had promised they would have a helicopter ambulance on site, and they didn't. But if you look here, where's the rescue people? You know, you got a couple marshals. Marshals are not trained to deal with an incident like that. They're not expected to deal with that. Who's this guy? We don't. That's a photographer. I think we might even recognize him. You know, this is a bit later, but basically they went in there with hacksaws and the pit crew, the team pit crew, rescued him. Terrible. People were really, really upset at that. So that was enough. So the next day, Jochen Moss, coming out of 1 up here, overcooks it, hits the guardrail. Guardrail falls over. They look at the posts and they're rotten. And I think that probably the drivers back in the garage were saying, "Are we going to run? Are we going to pack it in now?" So there was a lot of talk. So I've read a couple of different reports of how this transpired. What I do know, because I was in the tower, from my vantage point in the tower, I do know that the clerk of the course, Paul Cook, agreed to a request to drive James Hunt around the track. He drove around the track. I don't know if were you there? So you know this story. You must know this story. Drove around the track, and he interviewed drivers, marshals, What are your qualifications? What is your experience? As if that had something to do with James Hunt. I was livid. As far as I'm concerned, Paul Cook should have said to him, the FIA has inspected this course and approved it. If you have a beef, talk to the FIA. And if you can't wait to talk to the FIA, talk to the stewards. Talk to the stewards, because you know what I was going to say. I was going to say that. The FIA has approved the course. But the fallout would have been that the track would never have been approved again for an F1 course, the track. Now, little known fact, again, I was in the tower, and I was in the tower during lunch hour when there was hardly anybody there. The telephone communication system was, I say unreliable in my notes, but it was out. There was no communication system. You maybe knew that too, if you were on a corner. We had no, it was probably more than just lunch hour, but the whole of lunch hour, from the time we stopped, whatever we were doing before lunch, to about 15 minutes before the green for the Formula One race, we had no telephone communications. So I was the chief steward, the chief steward of the meet for that. And so I was rehearsing my lines to say, there will be no race. You will not drop the green flag. Fortunately, I think it's fortunate, I didn't have to do that. But, so anyway, I think everybody dropped the ball on that, including the FIA. I don't think they should have approved. If the course was that bad, they shouldn't have approved it. And they should have an inspector there for the race. So there we go. I have too many buttons here. So on the bright side, if I can get my notes, Gilles Villeneuve had been signed with McLaren, and he went to Silverstone in '77 in July, the end of June, July. Must have been July because I was there. And he had a really good run, really excellent run. He finished 11th, but had he not pitted because he thought his car was overheating, he probably would have finished 7th. Really excellent run, better than Moss by quite a bit. But Jochen Mass, his teammate at that time. He had a contract. McLaren had also tested Patrick Tambay, who is a good driver. They went with Tambay for whatever reason. So here's Villeneuve. Just out of luck, just beached. So Chris Amon, who had been responsible for the Dallara Wolf Formula One car in '77, the same year, he called up Enzo Ferrari, who he worked with, who he'd driven for, and said, hire Villeneuve, hire Villeneuve. And they did. They hired him with a full-time contract as of '78. So when they got to Canada in '77, they had a third car for him. And this was his debut with Ferrari, right there, that 21 car. Lauda had clinched the championship here, what did I say, a week before or 2 weeks before? The week before, here, Lauda had won the and so he was going to go to another team. He was going to go to Brabham. So he decided, and as I understand it, they unceremoniously fired his mechanic here because he was going with him to Brabham. They just said, so Ferrari here, before they left the track here, said, forget it, you're done. So Lauda was totally pissed, and he said, I'm done, that's it. And he says, and on top of that, you're running 3 cars, you're not going to provide proper support. I think that was just bullshit. But anyway, he said that. You're running 3 cars, I'm not going to run them if you're running 3 cars. So he didn't show up. Ferrari tried to protest Lauda because he had been entered in the event and had withdrawn without giving enough notice. Well, the team owner can't protest his own driver. I don't think that's possible. Anyway, that's what we thought. We couldn't see any way that Ferrari could protest Lauda because Ferrari was the entrant, not Lauda. They were really protesting themselves. So we just said, forget that. Villeneuve was running about 9th. He spun off in oil and turned 9, and he retired. Here he is, spun off in oil. He had finished 11th in the McLaren at Silverstone. Okay, here's a picture that's pretty blurry, but it's important because I suspect most of you in here are going to know this story. So somebody in the audience, what's this a picture of? Somebody I haven't already told. Don't you all recognize what that is? 70, this is 77. Okay, that marshal on the ground, his name is Ernie Strong. Okay, does that start to ring a bell?
I was right there, I watched that.
Okay, well, you give your version of it when you get up here. So I was in the tower, but Hunt was coming around to trying to catch Andretti, who was leading. He came up past Moss. I still can't quite figure out. I think Moss was a lap down, but he finished on the lead lap, so I don't know how that happened. Anyway, he came by to go by Moss, and there was a miscommunication about which side he should have gone on.
He just walked into the swing it out.
Oh, well, I'm not there yet. But they came by, there was a miscommunication which side Hunt was supposed to go on. And he got knocked off, he hit the guardrail pretty heavily and was kind of trapped in. Ernie went, pull him out. He had to leave a shoe behind to get out. So Hunt is out. He's presumably a bit dazed if he's been that had much impact. And he starts to walk towards the track. You're going to put the details in when you get here. He starts to walk towards the track. Eddie Marshall's trained to know that driver might be confused when he gets out of the car. You've got to really kind of watch that they don't do something stupid. When they start to walk towards the track, you're going to restrain them. And if that doesn't work, you're going to restrain them a bit stronger. Ernie goes to stop him from walking towards the track. I now know from reading the biographies that Hunt is tremendously volatile. So he just swings. Tremendous haymaker. Knocks Ernie Strong to the ground, flat to the ground. So as stewards, after the race we dealt with it, Hunt was long gone. But we unanimously agreed to give him the maximum fine. It wasn't much, it was 1,000 Swiss francs, which was kind of a joke now. But that's the worst we could do to him. We were really upset about it. Now I think that Ernie, and I can't say any more than this, I think Ernie had his own resolution of this afterwards. But you tell that part. You tell that part of the story. I don't know. So anyways, it turned out Andretti was leading 78 of the laps, but he stopped for lack of oil pressure. Jody Scheckter, who was driving this Wolf car, which was running in Canadian livery at Montreal 2 weeks ago, where it says Castro, there were Canadian flags. It ran a little different variations. A little Canadian flag right in front of the driver's head there. But it definitely had a Canadian identity. Walter Wolf's Austrian who made a lot of money hauling materials at Expo 67. And here he is, Walter Wolf, Jody Scheckter, Canadian. So we were pretty happy that a Canadian car had won that race. Scheckter had won twice before in that car, and even though he had 7 retirements that year, he finished second behind Lauda in the championship standing. Maybe that's a measure of I don't know, of what? I don't know what that's a measure of. So if I'd bought a program that year, which I didn't, I would have discovered this graphic in the program, which said next year's race is at Toronto's exhibition place. That's where the Indy, now called Honda Indy, is held. And it's more or less the layout for that. So that was Labatt's plan, was they were going to go to Toronto and they were going to have it there. There had been an earlier plan to do that by a different promoter, and people from Mosport had raised so much hell that they got the locals all riled up and they convinced the councillors to vote it down. So they come back here about 5 years later or so, and they want to run their own race, the Grand Prix. Well, those people remembered all those horror stories that have been told, and they convinced their councillors to turn it down. So the story goes, the next day, Jean Drapeau, Montreal's mayor, got on the phone to Labatt's and said, well, let's go to Montreal. There's a lot of legend in that. But no question, it went to Montreal. So It's the same circuit, two different names. Obviously, it became Gilles Villeneuve after his death in '72. And it's still there this year. And it looks like it's going to be there for quite a while, despite the little glitches. The contract with now called F1 Group, Formula One Group, has been extended to 2029. And between the three levels of government, there's a promise of about $100 million, which sounds like a lot, but in a way over that many years, 15 years, it's actually not that much. So here's the site of Expo 67, and that's where they built the track. So this is, I believe, in 67 or very shortly after. Most of the buildings, if not all of them, are still there. The track portion that ran along here, this is where the pits are now, is along here. This is the rowing basin back here. This is kind of a lake that's still there. This building is now the casino. That was the French pavilion. This was the Quebec pavilion. It's now been seemingly converted to be an extension of the casino. Pretty well everything else you see, with the exception of whatever they call this. This is the U.S. pavilion, this dome, and the bridge itself is gone. I think the press used to have to meet in there, but Lionel doesn't quite agree with me on that, so I could be wrong. So anyway, the track came along here, it went back up around this lake, and it came back along here, under this bridge, deked like that, came up around, these buildings were pretty well gone, and then came around, back like that. So Roger Pert, I'm trying to be charitable to him. I'm not a big admirer of Roger's. I've said it. He was a CASC officer, and he was commissioned to find a location of the new circuit. An obvious choice was Ile Notre Dame. And that's an artificial island built for Expo 67. This whole island here was artificial. That's Ile Saint Helene, and part of that, probably this part, was artificial. So it was used also for Expo 67 and the 76 Olympics for the rowing. This location has proven to be an ideal one for the Canadian Grand Prix. And even though I'm not a big admirer of Roger Pert, I think this is a major achievement on his part. And I think that we can all be proud of his achievement and congratulate him for it. There's a lot of things he's done that I haven't been very happy with, before and since. This is the layout of the circuit. We're down 78, and I'm almost done. The pits were back here after the hairpin. There's the rowing basin, there's that lake, and there's the big bridge there. Okay, there's the cover for 78. Andretti had won the championship that year with the revolutionary ground effects Lotus 79. And that was, I meant to say this earlier, but the Cosworth engine made the 70s the greatest period in Formula One, because everybody had the same engine, it was competitive, and even though there were a couple other engines, the Cosworth engine was a winning engine, so many teams were very closely matched, and there were lots of different winners. And the ground effects was the next revolution. Lotus came up with it first. Andretti won in 79, and he'd already won the championship by then. So there he is on the cover. However, you may also remember that when Andretti won the championship, he won it after Ronnie Peterson died as a result of an accident at Mons in the preceding race. And that then meant Andretti became immediately the champion, because Peterson was no longer a competitor. So they got Jean-Pierre Jarier, found him to drive the Peterson car, And he put it right in the front row with Jody Scheckter there. So Jody's still doing pretty well. But here's Gilles. This is his first year, full year with Ferrari. He's in the second row, the third fastest car. And Andretti, his car never ran properly. He's way back here. There was more. There's Bobby Rahal, Keke Rosberg. So there's the start. Jarier and Scheckter come firing off the start front row. Number 12 in the middle, the next row back, there's Villeneuve. Put this picture in to show you that in 78, a lot of the buildings were still there. So we forget that now because nothing is visible in this picture, except maybe that building which may be back in the city. None of those buildings are there anymore or have been for a long time. So there's Jarier. He had the race under control. I'm missing something here. Let's see what I said. Oh, Jarrier's start was Jones got ahead of Jarier, but he had a slow puncture, which moved Jarier up to the lead. Scheckter was in second, Villeneuve was third. Mid-race, Villeneuve passed Scheckter to take second. That was like the second coming when he got into second place. Huge roar. Jarier was dominant. But he retired with an oil leak. Remember, Andretti had an oil leak the previous year at Mosport. And it left Villeneuve in no opposition. He continued to take his first career win in his home race ahead of Scheckter with Reutemann running third. Nobody cares that if Jarier hadn't dropped out that he would have won. Villeneuve won the race, the greatest Canadian racing hero ever, engraved in stone forever. I just say in my notes, and the crowd went wild. It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. If I get this picture, there's, that may be a piece of your picture, Lionel. I think it is a piece of your picture. That fence behind, before he came around the next time on the cool-off lap, that fence was down, totally down. And the crowd was coming straight out on they were out to the edge of the track. They knew the car still on the track. They came out to the edge of the track. But that fence, that whole fence there, this whole fence along here, that was all down. And they just streamed across. That day that's a long story, but I watched the race from here. I think that may be me there, or maybe back here. One of these, there was a marshal's post back there, and I was, this show Last Survivor or whatever with Kiefer Sutherland? The concept of if when you have all the cabinet together, you have, say, one guy off to the side who can run the country. Designated survivor, that's what he would. Well, I was the designated survivor that day, so they put me over there. Literally, they put me over there, I guess because they'd had problems in Mosport with the communications, and they had problems, I think I heard other places as well. So they put me over there, so if communication broke down, we had a red flag over there, and I was in charge. There was no communication, I was in charge, and we would go out and we would stop the race. So I wasn't in the tower. So anyway, this is not a photograph. This is a painting. I think it's based on Lionel's picture, turning it. I think that's what it is. I don't think the pits were full like that when he took the checker. Because I have a picture that you're not supposed to, as a race official, take pictures. I was right across. Yeah. But I have a picture that I took into the pits when he came through. So I know that there was nobody in the pits because I have a picture. You're not supposed to when you're a race official take pictures, but I did. I admit it now, how many years later. So there's the results. The only one that counts is Villeneuve won. That's it. We don't care about anything else. Here's a similar picture to the one Lionel had. Oh, Lionel's going to show you later, sorry. There's our Prime Minister. Neither Lionel or I can remember his name right now. Anyway, there's Reutemann, there's Villeneuve, there's Schechter, there's Joanne, his wife, hidden behind. Here's another one where you can see Joanne and Gilles spraying that beer to all and sundry. This guy is, I'd probably like to do it in the PA. He's a Montreal reporter. Here's my picture, which shows Gilles, the Prime Minister, and the man in the hat, who's sort of responsible for it all, Jean Drapeau, the mayor of Montreal. He'd made, very controversially, all of these. He'd made Montreal, the Expo 67 happen, he'd made Expo happen, the Olympics, and this race. And outsiders from outside Montreal thought, oh, how much money is spent? How much of my money has gone into this? And the Olympic Stadium, they took 30 years to pay for and so on. But I think in Montreal, he was always a beloved figure. He said that Expo 67 can no more lose money than I can get pregnant. Well, it lost money big time. Here's a family picture taken the same day. His younger brother, Jacques, his wife, Joanne, Gilles, his father Seville, his mother, Georgette, and this youngster down in the front that we've heard more of since, right? The little Jacques. And so we kind of know that the name of that tune now. If I can do this. Here's a cover photograph of Gilles at Expo and Motorsport. Here's the magazine I was writing for, Autosport Canada, and it's a composite picture. But to me, this kind of represents the iconic form of the Canadian Grand Prix, of the 78 Grand Prix of Villeneuve, Montreal, that U.S. Dome, the skyline in the background. This is sort of the impression that's imprinted. Pete Lyons wrote in the magazine he was writing for at the day, the Disney-esque victory of Villeneuve must have cemented the future of the GP in the minds of Quebecois for many years to come. How true. So the development of the circuit on Ile Notre Dame was the right track in the right place, right up against the city. Despite changing ideas of what F1 track should be like, this track has aged well over the years, and Montreal has become a destination city for F1 fans. And with Gilles' popular win in '78 and his success in subsequent years, although he never won the championship, of course, he has indeed made the Grand Prix of Montreal a great piece of Canadian heritage. And this '78 race is the iconic Canadian Grand Prix. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to do about 4 more slides. Jumping ahead to 87, there was no race in 87. This had to do with conflict over sponsorship. Labatt had been the sponsor, had signed a contract with CASC. Somebody else had signed a contract with Molson. Bernie wanted to go with Molson because there was more money, I think. So he refused to. He just simply refused to bring the cars to Montreal when there was Labatt sponsorship. So there was no race. There was a race. Have I got? No, I've skipped forward. There was a race in '88 under Molson sponsorship. Some other good came from this. What did I say that back there? Yeah. CASC was disenfranchised, and a new ASN was created. We have an ASN that's basically Bernie's puppet. No other really fair way of explaining it. The ASN we have, Roger Pert is the chair, isn't it? part of my enmity towards him, is basically Bernie's puppet. And the people who have, a man by the name of Terry Lovell, who wrote a book called Bernie's Game, he says the FIA arranged the setting up of what was effectively his own, Bernie's, National Sporting Authority. And nothing has changed. I don't think even with Bernie retiring from FO, Formula One management, I think he still controls. I think he still controls the ASN Canada. I won't say any more for fear of being accused of libel, because I could say some more libelous things than that. Anyway, a good part about it was Bernie got what he wanted, and he wanted to have a race in Montreal, and he wanted to make a lot of money out of it, and so everybody's happy but me. And the people, the CSC loyalists. But one of the things that we did get, that they moved the pits. So during '87, when there was no race going on, they built the new pit complex, which was located. It was here. They moved it down to here, which was a much better location. The only problem with that was the pit exit came out kind of awkwardly in the middle of that straight, which was a bad idea. I don't know quite how that happened. I had some more pictures, but there, that's it. I'm going to wind up there. So those are the years that I was most involved. My involvement really after Gilles was killed with Formula One, for a number of reasons, became much less. And there's been a lot of history since then, but that's my version of it. I've taken more time than I intended. That's it. Oh, I'm done. And I'm going to introduce Lionel, who's going to come up and take over for me.
Thank you, George, for an excellent presentation. And I would like to thank Glenda Gephardt and Tom Wiedemann of the IMRRC for inviting me to be a panelist on this prestigious discussion group celebrating 50 years of the Canadian Grand Prix. It is truly an honor. And I mentioned George's excellent presentation. As he indicated, many of the photos used in his discussion were photos taken by yours truly and published in Jerry Donaldson's excellent book, The Grand Prix of Canada, that covers the years 1967 to 1983. In fact, I'm very proud that of the 162 photos in the book, 50 were mine. And yes, some of them will be repeated in my presentation. I became interested in cars in the mid-1950s with the emphasis on sports cars and racing. Road and Track, Car and Driver, and Competition Press were the Bibles in those days. And I still have more than 50 years of each of Road and Track and Car and Driver, much to the chagrin of my wife, Melanie, in the audience. Born in Montreal, my developing passion in sports cars led me to the sports car clubs, and specifically the Montreal MG Car Club, as it was the most focused on organizing races. Not being able to afford to race, I quickly realized the next best thing to be in the thick of things was to become a racing journalist and photographer. It got me into the pits, as well as right up to the edge of the pavement of the track. Pure heaven. And I didn't have to pay for an entry ticket. After several years of writing letters to racing newspapers and magazines, a few editors began to say yes, and some of my photos and reports were eventually published. My career as a racing journalist and photographer was launched. However, this led to my next epiphany, that although I loved the sport, the cars, the people, and the travel involved in racing, the chances of earning a living from the sport were very slim. I therefore became a professional accountant, and it solved two problems at once. Namely, I could earn a steady, decent living and also afford to indulge my passion. Born in Montreal and having lived there for 36 years, I was acutely aware of the constant rivalry between Montreal and Toronto, or more broadly, the provinces of Quebec and Ontario, on many fronts. Whether it was our NHL hockey teams, pro football teams, Major League Baseball teams, and of course sports car racing and the tracks. Once they took to a sport, the French Canadians of the province of Quebec were very passionate about it, and the relevant excellent stars that they developed. This year we're marking the 50th anniversary of Formula One in Canada, and the first one having taken place in 1967. That year was also the 100th anniversary or centennial of the founding of Canada as a nation. The 1967 celebrations of that milestone included Expo 67, the World's Fair in Montreal that George mentioned many times, wall-to-wall festivals, parties, and unbridled joy and happiness throughout the city of Montreal. What a stark contrast to today's world. Mosport is located about 60 miles east of Toronto and was built in 1961, quickly became the leading purpose-built road racing track in Canada. In '64, it was Montreal's turn, and the construction of Le Circuit Mont-Tremblant, situated amongst the beautiful ski hills in the Laurentian Mountains, was built 90 miles north of Montreal. The 67 centennial approached, the topic in the sports car clubs and CASC, the Canadian governing body of the sport, was to get on the calendar of the World Championship, or F1. What better time to have the first F1 in Canada than in its centennial year? The lobbying and politicking between Mosport and Mont-Tremblant was fierce, and eventually the FIA granted the first ever Canadian Grand Prix for F1 cars to Mosport in 1967, our centennial year. Mont-Tremblant would get the race the following year, and in theory the two tracks would hold the Grand Prix in alternate years. Reality and many factors soon set in, which George covered quite well, and unfortunately Mont-Tremblant and Mosport faded out of the picture. This was the beginning years of my career as a photojournalist for racing and cars. A good friend of mine in Montreal was a chap called Bob McGregor, if not the first, possibly one of the very first to have a network show that went right across the country in Canada on radio. It was 30 minutes of sports car racing and news and car road testing every Monday at about 6:30 Monday night. He would have correspondents from throughout Canada, the States, and Europe reporting on all the major events. Bob did road tests of cars. He called up Rolls-Royce in Montreal one day and said, "I'd like to do a road test of your car. Can I get one?" Somehow they foolishly agreed. This was the result of gorgeous, gorgeous burgundy with the tan leather interior. And that particular weekend, much to the chagrin of Rolls-Royce, they didn't realize the car would be going to Watkins Glen for its US Grand Prix. About 50 miles out of Montreal, Bob invited me along for the ride, and I said, sure, why not? About 50 miles out of Montreal, Bob got tired of driving it. He said, this is a pile of crap. Lionel, why don't you take the wheel? Sure, thank you. And I drove the rest of the way to the Glen. And as we were coming down Highway 14 from Geneva, I pulled over the side of the road. I said, "Bob, I want you to get into the back seat on the passenger side." "No, Lionel, I'm not." "Bob, do it." He listened to me. He didn't know what I was going to come up with, but it was going to be some fun. The Glen Motor Court, as probably most of you know, is on the hill coming into town here in the Glen, and was one of the centers of F1 racing throughout the years. The teams would book it this year for next year, completely sold out a year in advance. I drove up in the driveway of the entrance to the Glen Motor Court, jumped out of the car, and went around to the rear door, opened it for Bob to get out. For those of you that know it, there's a little bit of a driveway that comes in right at the front door of the office, and immediately next to it is a great big picture window of the office. Naturally, this car got a bit of attention as we rolled up, and my role of getting out and opening the door for Bob sort of enhanced it a bit. And he went into the office and said, "I would like a room for tonight." Playing dumb that the Grand Prix was on that weekend, and they fell over themselves apologizing that the place was full. They must have spent over an hour on the phone calling every available hotel, motel, B&B within 100 miles of here, and eventually found a place for us. Thank you, Rolls-Royce. We then drove into town and found a parking spot on Franklin Street, which was amazing. Parked the car, and Bob took his tape recorder out, standing beside the car, doing radio interviews, and for some reason, the only people interviewed were these very cute, young-looking girls. That was the Rolls-Royce story. From there, this is the aerial view of Mosport in 1973 at the Can-Am, and you can see basically the outline of the track. And this is the Mont Tremblant aerial view, the actual inaugural Can-Am in '66. Now there's an interesting story to this aerial view. The promoters hired a helicopter for the press to take them up and take aerial views of the track. The pilot tried to be very obliging and took off the passenger door of the helicopter. And as we lifted off, I'd never been in a helicopter in my life, but I said, "Wow, this is fantastic." And he went around the track a few times, and we're talking back and forth. He kept asking me where would I like to take the pictures from, where to shoot, how to position the helicopter. And he got to the end of the track, and very obligingly just hovered at the hairpin at the end and tilted the helicopter a good 30 degrees so I could take my picture. I was holding on to the frame of the doorless opening with one hand, my 2 feet braced against the dead pedals, and clicking away with the camera with my free hand. I didn't fall out, fortunately. That's the result. I'm very fortunate. I don't have a fear of heights. This is a picture that George had in his presentation. It shows a beautiful, spectacular setting of the Mont Tremblant track. Absolutely glorious there. And this is the same picture again that George had of Jack Brabham winning the first race at Mosport. I want you to take note of the control tower on the inside of the track. The timers and scores were on the ground floor, and the press room was on the second floor, and I'll refer to that later in my presentation. Again, Denny Hume in my picture is on the left, Jack Brabham, Dan Gurney, and this is a chap, Rod Campbell, on the PA system, who since he was from Montreal went on to much bigger and better things in the States and became a very well-known PR person in the racing field. An event at that race in the rain that you'll never see today. This is Graham Hill, spun out in the wet, got out of the car, which he could never do today on his own probably, and started pushing it down the track, jumped in, and somehow got it restarted. This would never happen today. The drivers in those days were very approachable. Nobody was a prima donna, and you could go up to the drivers, whether you're press or not, and this was an image right here in Watkins Glen at the old pits. Joe Bonnier on the left, Roy Salvadori on the right, and they were having a casual game of cards in between qualifying and practice and whatever. 1960. 61, the card game continues. You'd never see this today. John Surtees became one of my favorite people in motor racing. And I'll take you through a few pictures and then tell you a story about him. That's his car that he built after a few years of racing other cars. That's John Surtees at Mosport in the wet. John Surtees telling his driver, Koenigs, I have it somewhere. In any case, that was his driver. John had retired from driving, and he was explaining a corner to him and that sort of thing. And John, towards the end of his retirement from the days of motorsport. In 1965, John had a horrendous accident in a Lola T70, the pre-Can-Am car at Mosport. It was life-threatening, and he survived it. Miraculously, he recovered before the Formula One season started in 1966. And the inaugural Can-Am at Mont Tremblant was September of '66, a year after this horrendous accident. I was out as usual around the track shooting, and the end of the afternoon on practice and qualifying, I came back to the pit area, met my former wife there, and she said, I want you to meet somebody. That somebody turned out to be John Surtees. How did this happen? My then wife was on top of the control tower at Mont Tremblant for VIP spectators and was standing next to another lady during this practice session and qualifying, and she just said, not knowing who this person was, isn't it wonderful to see John back in a car again? The other lady turned to her and said, thank you. And my former wife didn't know what to take from that and said, what do you mean? Well, I'm Pat Surtees. And the rest of the afternoon, they conversed back and forth. And at the end of the afternoon, when I got back from shooting on the track, that's when I met John Surtees. He was the most humble man, the most ferocious man behind the wheel, and yet he was a complete gentleman. And from that point on, every race that I went to that he was at, I made a point of going to say hello to him, whether it was a Can-Am, whether it was a Formula One, or anything else. Fast forward to 1987, thank you. My new wife, who's in the audience, and I decided we're taking a vacation trip to England. And about a week or 2 weeks before that, it was one of these show tours, London show tours, that you bought a week's package and everything was arranged. But we were going to add on about 10 days prior to that week of just touring around the countryside. I called up John. I said, you probably don't remember me. I'm sure you see hundreds, if not thousands, of press people and photographers over the year, but I was at Mont Tremblant, Mosport, and Watkins Glen, and spoke to you quite often. We're coming over to England for a vacation, If it's at all possible, I'd love to stop by, have a cup of tea with you and my wife, and no photography, no story, no interviews, nothing, just a personal chat. He said, by all means, give me a call when you land here and I'll tell you what's going on for my day. An overnight flight from Montreal. We landed about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, got our rental car, fell asleep in a parking lot somewhere, and about 9 o'clock woke up and I called John. John, we've arrived, we're here, we're near the airport. I'm tied up till 4 o'clock, he said, but please come by then, and he gave me the directions. John lived on a spectacular estate just out of London. I believe it was about 90 acres in total. All kinds of ponds with swans in them, and just an incredible, incredible place. He welcomed us as a real gentleman. We had a lovely chat. He said, would you like to see some of my toys? Of course. And he took me over to one of the buildings beside his home that had, I don't know, about a dozen varieties of Ferrari, and I was just drooling all over every one of them. And then he said, let's go to the next building, open the door, and here's all his World Championship motorcycles. I was absolutely blown away that this man, this God in racing, would welcome me so openly and treat me so beautifully. We went back to the house and he explained that the oldest part of the house was from the 13th century and the newer wing was from the 15th century. He would love to have us stay overnight, but the guest suite is being renovated. But please come back when you're through your touring outside of London, before you go to London, and we'll invite you for dinner. I thanked him profusely. I said, absolutely, we would do that. And he said, by the way, I've arranged, since I couldn't put you folks up here tonight, there's an inn down the road, the Henry VIII Inn, a bed and breakfast. We got there, the place was amazing. Again, I thanked him profusely. We were ushered into the Anne Boleyn room, one of the 8 wives, I guess. Everything was wall-to-wall red velvet. It was mind-blowing. I won't go into the details. Went down for breakfast the next morning, had a lovely breakfast, English breakfast, and we were ready to check out. I went down to the front desk. I said, I'd like to settle my bill. Oh, that's quite all right, Mr. Birnbom. Mr. Surtees has taken care of this. My jaw dropped to the floor. I just couldn't believe his hospitality. I don't claim or pretend to be a media star, but this was just overwhelming. We went and did our thing for the next 10 days, came back, called up John. I said, we're through touring, and if you'd like, we could come by. You suggested the possibility of dinner. He says, yes, we have it all arranged. Please come by. His formal dining room must have been 50 to 75 feet long, without exaggeration, longer, almost as long as the entire auditorium. And the table was the full length. He had set one place for himself and his new wife, Jane, who happened to be the nurse that nursed him through his recovery of the accident at Mosport. He was set up at the far end of the table and had Melanie and I set up at this end of the table. We all had a great laugh out of that. And then he moved the 2 place settings down, and we had a wonderful dinner, wonderful chat back and forth. I was just overwhelmed. And this is the kind of driver and superstar in motorsport that I don't think exists today. These were truly the golden years. He was amazing. As a professional accountant, I am acutely aware that at the end of the day, dollars and the economics greatly impact each and every endeavor and eventually drive the direction of its development, no matter what it is. This fundamental concept was certainly true in our beloved sport a half-century ago, and still today. Notwithstanding all the enthusiasm for Mosport and Mont-Tremblant, as the years unfolded, it became apparent that neither of those tracks were financially viable, nor could they meet the rapidly escalating costs of a Grand Prix weekend. I won't get to this. Yes, I should. I guess I can do this now. This is before Montreal. This was a gentleman in Montreal called Peter Broker, who sold and manufactured performance exhaust systems for sports cars and sedans in the late 50s, early 60s, called the Stebro exhaust systems. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. And he built a Formula Junior called the Stebro Formula Junior. In those days, the Formula Junior specs were very close to the F1 of that season, and he did whatever mods he had to do, entered it here at Watkins Glen, was accepted. So really, this is the first Canadian-built Formula One car that ever raced. And this is a picture of Peter in the car on the Watkins Glen track. So I'm getting into some of the drivers in Canada, the manufacturers, the teams. The next gentleman is Peter Ryan. His father had a hotel, a ski resort in the Mont-Tremblant area way before the track was built. His father was from Philadelphia, Joe Ryan, an American. Peter was born in the States, but grew up in the Mont-Tremblant area. He was a downhill ski champion and was incredibly fast, won many Canadian championships, and the year that the Olympics came up, there was a great controversy as to whether he could enter the Olympics as a Canadian or an American. And eventually he didn't race in the Olympics and he turned to cars, fortunately for us. Let's go back. So Peter, this is in the early 60s, he had a Porsche 550 RS as his first toy that he drove around the twisties in Mont-Tremblant. And the skiing helped him to feel whatever was under him that was on the edge of adhesion, and developed his control and his talent of the car enormously from that skiing exercise. He had the Porsche RS, then he got an RS60. He had a tremendous dice with Roger Penske at Lime Rock. Roger then had a birdcage Maserati, and they had a tremendous dice the entire race. Roger won it. Peter was second. Roger invited Peter into the car for the flag victory lap. The sportsmanship was fantastic in those days. Peter then got a Lotus 19, came to Mosport before there was a Formula One, but they called it the Canadian Grand Prix. Sterling Moss was there in a similar Lotus 19. I believe the first year they call it a Lotus Monte Carlo. And Pedro Rodriguez had a 3-liter Ferrari, a V12, and there was a number of other international stars. Peter won the race, beating Moss clean, and put on an enormous show. His talent was fantastic. Colin Chapman heard about it and signed him up to have a series or a season in Europe in the Formula Junior Lotus series that was just the developing stages for Formula One. Things went awry, and long story short, in one of the races at Reims in France, Peter was killed in that car. He would have been one of the first Canadian superstars without a doubt, but we lost him before we had a chance. The other people that have competed or been in Formula One, This is Bill Brack in the high back wing car. I believe it was a Lotus. That's Bill Brack again in another year. He competed 3 times in the Canadian Grand Prix, and they were all rent-a-rides. And here he is a 3rd time in the BRM. Epi Weitz was a rent-a-ride in one of the years and under the auspices of Team Canada. Al Pease, that George mentioned, had a ride in Formula One and didn't show too well. This is George Eaton, where he bought a ride with BRM and he didn't show too much in his various years. This is Gilles Villeneuve's brother, Jacques, not his son, in the Arrows, and he tried on, I think it was 2 occasions, to qualify for the F1 in Montreal, and he just wasn't fast enough, but he did try. This was the last race at Mosport in 1977, and George mentioned this. Jody Scheckter won it in the Wolf, and that's Walter Wolf on the right, who was originally from Austria, made a fortune with oil drilling equipment before he moved to Montreal, and became a car enthusiast that went on to building his own car. Actually, he bought up 60% of the Williams team that year, and the team that James Hunt was involved with, I think it was James Hunt, was going out of business, so he bought up the assets of that, and that became the basis of the Wolf team. Here we are in Montreal, Gilles in the Ferrari and the Wolf behind, and I believe that's Kiki Rosberg, whose son Nico won the World Championship last year. This is Gilles Villeneuve in his younger days. Very personable, very down-to-earth individual. He started his career on snowmobiles and snowmobile racing. And like Peter Ryan, he felt the edge of adhesion and control on ice and snow. And that brought him into 4 wheels. He started with a Formula Ford, and he immediately began winning races. Moved up to Formula Atlantic. He's on the inside of the front row, and he was fearless. Nobody would push him off the track. Nobody would gain an inch on him if he could avoid it. And he went on to bigger and better things, and eventually Formula One. Here he is when Jody and Gilles were teammates for Ferrari. They were the best of friends. Jody referred to him at his funeral in the eulogy as one of the fastest racing driver in the history of motorsport. He was absolutely adored in Quebec. He grew up in Montreal, or just east of Montreal in Birchierville. And I'll come to the 78 fairy tale in just a moment. The next year in Montreal, that's Alan Jones won the race, and they had a fantastic days for the entire race. They were the best of friends at the end of it. There was no trying to push anybody off the track. Good, clean racing, wheel-to-wheel racing. Alan won it, and he wanted to hold Gilles' hand up to say he deserves a lot of the applause as well. Great friendship, great sportsmanship. This was in Montreal in the Ferrari. He hit something, I don't remember what it was. Might have been a car.
The Wall of Champions.
The Wall of Champions? Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, he clipped it.
That didn't stop him. He had no aerodynamics. He kept on racing. Gilles never gave up, never quit. He would just keep going. He beat the hell out of a car. He'd extract the absolute best you could ever get out of a car. And this is what made him such an amazing driver. That's the podium picture that George had, or very similar to it. His brother Jacques is on the far left, Mayor Drapeau, our former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was a real sports car fan. He had his own 300 SL before he became Prime Minister. His son is the Prime Minister now, Justin. And I believe that Sam Posey with his head down, who was a racer and artist centered around Lime Rock primarily, Reutemann and Gilles the winner. This was the fairy tale race in Montreal. That previous picture, where he won the race, in my book, I have this picture and the next one side by side. This one I've called the best of times. Doesn't need much explanation. And this is the picture beside it, the worst of times, at Gilles' funeral at Bircheville in Montreal that I had to attend. Jody was there, Gilles' daughter Melanie, Joanne, and young Jacques, his son, that later got into Formula One and actually won the World Championship. And this is the part of the picture that George had. Of the 40,000 images I have in my historic collection, this without a doubt is my absolute favorite. Gilles winning, his hands up, the flag, the banner, the crowd behind, and I must admit that I had a bit of an input into how the picture was put together. I went to the flag marshal about 5 or 10 laps from the end, and it looked like Gilles was pretty certainly going to win it. I said, look, don't start waving the flag when he's a half mile down the track. I want you to time it so that you just about hit him over the head with the checkered flag as he crosses the finish line. I went down about a couple of 100 feet from the finish line, got right up at the guardrail, pushed people out of the way. I didn't give a damn. I was going to get this picture. That's the result. It's my absolute favorite. It's been on magazine covers. It's in my book. It just tells the whole story. And now some miscellaneous pictures. I was going to continue about talking about the cost of racing before I get to these pictures. And I cut off a moment ago saying that Mont Tremblant and Mosport were not viable and could no longer afford what has become today a very, very expensive circus and a Grand Prix weekend. Fortunately for us all, the municipal, provincial, and federal politicians, Montreal, the province of Quebec, and the federal people in Canada miraculously agreed on one thing, and the Canadian Grand Prix found a permanent home in Montreal in 1978. It is still held there today and will be into the foreseeable future. It has been reported that well over 100,000 spectators pay to see the race on race day in Montreal, and the week-long activities that go on and the parties and all the closed streets events in downtown Montreal generate some $90 million for the city's economy. Numbers that neither Mosport nor Mont Tremblant could ever match. I started talking about the Canadians involved, and now we'll go to just some wrap-up pictures. A very early portrait of Jim Clark, phenomenal racer. You could see the difference in the helmets, the face goggles, the so-called driving suit. I don't even know if it was fireproof in those days. This is about 1960 or 61. Here is Bruce McLaren in one of his early races. That was, I'm guessing, since there's 6 cylinders on this side, a V12. This is an overhead of Jackie Stewart in the BRM, and this was technically called an H16, I believe was the designation, a 16-cylinder motor. and all the details of the engine compartment, the suspension, and so on. This was a race at Montreal, one of the double-winged. Now, am I going to do this right? I think so. The rear wing was split in the middle and flexible, and that's the smaller front wing. And this was the only split wing in the rear, I believe. And what it did, the strut went right down to the suspension member on both sides, whereas the other ones would go straight to the frame. And what that did, as the rear suspension on one side moved, half of the rear wing could move in the same direction. The double wing cars and the high wings were gone the next year, but it's an interesting picture. And you can see all the rear suspension, the motor. For the techies, I guess they love that kind of picture. Jackie Steward in his earlier days, in his famous cap. Jackie Ickx winning the event at Mont Tremblant. Denny Hume. This was the start of one of the races at Mosport. Whoops, come back here. That, I believe, is Jackie Stewart watching the flag start. You could see his head turn to the right to see if they're going to get the green flag to start. They used the Canadian flag that day. That's the BRM, and that's the other Ilf Tyrrell. That's an interesting shot. And again, this is the control tower on the inside, the timing people and lap scoring there, and the press room up in this corner. I forgot to mention that with Jill. I happened to be up in the press room and was watching as they came around this almost 90-degree turn onto the pit straight. Jill was in a Formula Atlantic pre-F1 days, and he lost it. And as Sterling Moss said, you don't know if you're going fast enough until you lose control of the car, and then you'd know you've gone over the line. Jill would test that just about every race, every day. He lost it coming around onto the pit straight, and this was not a wall at that time. It was just a barrier dividing the track from what was the pits just behind it. And I looked down at the track, and Joe came around, did a complete 360, and was backing into the barrier dividing the track from the pits. And I was looking down at him, and I saw his hand grab the shift leader. Before he stopped rolling backwards, he had it in first gear. He glanced down the track to see if anybody was coming, let the clutch out, and went screaming down the track. I don't think that entire episode lasted 2 to 3 seconds, but it's been burned in my memory ever since. What he could have done, and the timing was just phenomenal. He was an amazing guy. Jackie Stewart in the wet, some poor guy behind him caught in the spray. Jackie Stewart won the race. Colin Chapman on the left, and Ken Tyrrell chatting in the pits very casually, two superstars, very well-known people. Roger Penske and Mark Donohue, what an amazing pair of team owner and driver that just had the most incredible marriage in terms of the driver, the car, the team owner, and what they could do together in a very pensive, thoughtful pose there. Not a pose. Whoops, come back here. Then we have the first and only six-wheel car ever to race, the Tyrrell. I believe that was Patrick Depailler at Mosport. He's just coming into the pit lane. James Hunt, I was experimenting with some very tight close-up shots as they whizzed by and panning with the camera, even with the good speeds of the lens in those days. Sometimes I was on with the focus, and sometimes I wasn't, more often than not. but this time I was on, and it's a beautiful picture. Niki Lauda in the Ferrari. That is Alan Jones in the Williams, and I don't remember who that was, but that's one of the enormous sculptures that was on the site in Montreal at Expo 67 and was there for a long time. I'm not sure if it's still there or not. It's gone? 79 in Montreal, Alan Jones won the race and went on the victory lap with the flag. This is the start of, I believe, the same race. Gilles is on the front row with Alan Jones, and that could be Jody coming up on the grass right at the start of the race. This is a picture I enjoy, not because he wrecked the car, but René Arnoux in the Renault Elf stuffed it into the guardrail, got out and started walking away, and I just caught that expression on his face. Oh my goodness, what have I done? My French is lousy. Unfortunately, this picture doesn't show everything except the drag strip that's going down the pit lane, the old pit lane at Mont Tremblant, and it says happy motoring, and that is my presentation. Thank you. And now I'll introduce Tim, and it's his turn.
Okay, I flagged for, since I came back from Germany in 1967. In 1967, for the first Canadian Grand Prix, I went up intentionally just as a spectator because I'd only got back into the United States the Friday before. So I missed the U.S. Grand Prix that year because I was mustering out at Fort Dix. And I got up to Canada and bumped into the people that were the paddock marshals. And one of them, the one in charge, knew me from Europe and invited me to be a paddock marshal for the weekend. Sure, why not? At that time, they were called Perry's Merry Men, and I got to look after the Ferrari team for the weekend. Good start. Didn't know anything about that part of racing. At that time, I was strictly, I'd driven race go-karts when I was a kid, and did a lot of high-speed stuff in Germany. But now I was back in the U.S. in this state, I was up in Canada, but I had the opportunity to get involved. The following year, following year they'd gone to Saint-Gervais, but they also did, there was another, like what we used to have in the Watkins Glen, races that didn't count. So I did Perry's Merry Men for that one again. But in the meantime, I'd become a flagger in the U.S. And so I met the flag marshal that year, and for the next one they did come back, I flagged actually. So I really I did 2 years as a paddock marshal, and then I flagged all the rest of the races at Mosport. And I have actually flagged every station at Mosport too, in different categories. In F1, I worked Station 2 the day the Ernie Strong and James Hunt thing happened. And Station 2 is basically where 2-3 is where it happened. James Hunt was upset because he had been punted off he didn't go off on his own, he was helped. And James wanted to punch out the helper. And that's when Ernie Strong tried to grab him and prevent him from doing that. And James just came around and knocked Ernie down, and I kind of just chuckled. I said, Ernie, you weren't paying attention. That turn is a blind, hellish turn. Is you go over you go through two and drop down, you go into no man's land, and in 6-hour racing up there, there'd been a few fatal accidents where somebody went over the hump and went all the way out to the guardrail, which was almost 150 yards away, and still got killed. I've been involved in an awful lot of that type of thing in my years. When in the early era of racing that we're talking about at Mosport, we were losing 2 drivers and 2 flaggers every year. And that was basically all of the late 60s, early 70s, all the way through almost to the end of the 70s. That ratio was keeping up throughout the world, you know. I mean, it was a dangerous game, but I still loved it. And maybe I'm not all here, but taking risks and doing that type of danger is the only reason I wanted to work Formula One. And it's the only reason I've done 65 Formula One Grand Prix as a flagger. 2 as a paddock marshal, and 1 as an intelligent observer. Somebody that's helping corporate. That wasn't in Canada. That was, you know, I did in Canada. I did after Mosport. Of course, we went to Montreal, and I don't remember when these bibs started, but I have 10, 11, 12, and I know I've got a lot more, but they're not stored in any particular order, and I separated them out from U.S. bibs also, because I didn't want to bring any U.S. bibs. Got to be, you know, this is about Canada. So all the ones I brought, these are Canadian, and they are in sequence pretty much. The reason we got these was those numbers. The TV camera can pick them up very easily. So if you do something bad, you're never coming back. And you might even be fined or kicked out of Canada. We had one flagger that picked up a piece of a car at an accident scene. Wasn't a valuable piece, it wasn't worth anything, but he was asked to leave Canada and never come back. So, yeah, these bibs serve a purpose. And it's not what you'd think. You know, they're also sitting here, I realize, even though this is a aerated fabric, it looks, they're hot. And I now that I think about it, I remember that from wearing them, that no matter how good your flag suit was, and of course I flagged with full Nomex, that's hot, but you put this on and it's even hotter. At Montreal, I did every race in Montreal up through 13, except for the one year that the two Canadian governing bodies couldn't get along, and they decided that they were going to hire flaggers from off the street in Montreal. And all of us real flaggers got a free grandstand seat at the grandstands that had just been built inside the hairpin. Those grandstands are now, people have to order the tickets a year in advance or more to get them, because that's a very valuable seat. The ones around the outside, they're valuable, but nothing like the one on the inside. And the only people in that set of the grandstands were QRFA flaggers. The people that normally would have been flagging. The Formula One drivers were well aware of the situation, and so they would only rely on the blue flagging that was being done from the grandstands in that turn. The rest of the track, they just took it easy that year. They weren't going to make any mistakes. They weren't going to do anything that would risk getting hurt, because they knew there was nobody looking after them. And we did have, I think Didier Peroni was still the head of the GPDA at that time. And he stopped in the morning warm-up and got out of his car and came over and stood and waved to the flaggers in the grandstands, because he knew that's where we were. And he just wanted us to know, or that he knew we were there, and he's going to pay attention to us. It was a good feeling. It's, Formula One drivers are far and away the most observant to work with. You give them a blue flag, and this particular year I was the blue flag marshal. These bibs, some of them are corner captain or chief post, chief deputy post, or chief post. But this is blue flag marshal. That's actually the most important flagger in the business. The chief post is important because he's running the station, but the blue flagger is the one who saves the driver's life. He's the first one to go to a crash. For one, we see it. We see it coming, developing. We know it's going to happen right there, because we're the ones looking into the driver's eyes as they're coming into our turn. Where most everybody else in the turn is panning, watching traffic go by. We're concentrating on the eyes of the cars coming at us and the cars behind them, and we're listening so we know where every car is. A good blue flagger knows where every car is on a racetrack all the time. Because there are a lot of blind turns, especially at Montreal, because the 4A, 5, 6, 7 complex, that's coming down at the back straight. It's where there's been several accidents over the years, but you only get to see the car that you're going to blue flag for 4.3 seconds. In that amount of time, you have to know where the car is that just came out of 4 or is by 4A, that's faster, enough faster to where he's going to lap this guy coming into 6. And so you don't have much time to do this. You don't really see the cars. You have to hear them. You have to know who's who. And when they start pit cycles, you have to pick up on all the pit cycles. Luckily, now they do give the blue flagger a radio, and they give you information. When they first started giving blue flaggers information, they would say, blue flag 18. We don't know car numbers. You can't see car numbers on the Formula One cars up until 2 years ago. They finally put numbers on the front of the car to where you can actually see the number. But we just know the helmets and the car. We learn, we get a cheat sheet which has the picture of every car and every helmet. And we memorize that. Because there's only 22 cars. We can handle 22. But, all right, with the Jerrier race, that one that Villeneuve won, that was fairly a dry race. That wasn't. The next year, I think, was a awfully wet race, and Jerrier was driving for Ligier and ran away and hid because we were still running on the original, the first track, before they changed and put the casino in. When they put the casino in, 2 turns changed drastically. They became chicane. There was a chicane at the beginning of it. The elevation changed up to where the casino was, and then the drop down and the right-hand turn after that were gone. And they were really the 2 nicest turns on the track. They were artful turns. You're going up a hill, down, and they were gone because of the casino. But Jerrier did that race, the whole race, in a pouring rainstorm. Not just a little bit of rain. It was still in September, October, so it was cold, like 43 degrees. And it was really neat because I was working that station, which at that time was, I was on the first track, so that was 3. Yeah, I think that, the hook at the bottom was station 3. Because the old start finish used to be where 12 is now. And so like I've worked every station at Montreal. And the only races we get to work at Montreal, they had one year where they had an endurance race. I've never gone up for the NASCAR ones they ran there, but they were in the wet. And on, watching it on TV, they were great races. Because NASCAR doesn't race in the rain, and they proved they could. But as you go through most of those turns, it's a chicane to a straightaway, chicane to a straightaway, chicane to a straightaway. And the speeds down, coming into the last turn before start finish, if you watch it on TV, what the car is doing when he makes up his mind to go in the pits or stay on the race course, they're at 182 miles an hour. They make that chicane at 65. If they want to go in the pits, they can go straight into the pits at 98 until they get past the speed drop point, where they have to be down to 75, which is race day speed in the pits. During earlier on Friday and Saturday, Pit speed is like 35 or 40, depends on how they set it. And they do that, the cars are all built so that they program the car, so the driver just pushes a button that he's going into the pits. When he pushes that button, it almost turns the engine backwards to stop it. It's not, the driver doesn't have to use much brakes, it just stops itself. And the fuel gauge, the fuel filler comes up when they were doing fueling. As soon as he hit that button, down the car goes, and up comes the door. Now, of course, they're back to real racing where they run the full race on 57 gallons of gas. As opposed to when they were refueling, they never carried more than 35 at the most. Because that's, that's extra weight. But you think about them today, they start the race with 57 gallons of fuel. 57 times 8. By the end of the race, that car has lost 300 pounds. So that's why the fastest laps are always set right near the end. And who's going to do it? Kimi Räikkönen always does it. He's the best at waiting till the car is light to get the maximum out of it. But he almost always sets the fastest lap of a race. He doesn't win many races because he's not allowed to. He's number 2 man on the team. And that's Formula One. Let's see, what else do we know about Mosport? I've been there for several bad accidents that you don't like to think about, but it comes up every once in a while. Somebody wants to talk about an accident that happened at the start. Well, I'm well versed in it. Didier Pironi was the pole setter. And Riccardo Poletti was the unfortunate who was dead last on the grid. And couldn't see the waved hands from Pironi. He blew his clutch on the start. And he's waving his hands. Everybody else could see it, but the person way at the back trying to follow. But, that shut us down for an hour and a half. And those type of things happen in racing. But anymore, it's been a long time. The day that Senna was killed, I was working one of the last nationals at Bridgehampton. We had, I think, 4 last nationals at Bridgehampton before it finally stopped. But I think it was actually the last when that happened. And that was Formula One's last real fatal until 2 years ago when the guy ran into the picker, the cherry picker that was out moving a vehicle. And they were under a full course caution when he did it. So he obviously forgot where he was or what was going on. And it's too bad. We lost a good young man. But, as Sterling Moss said over here one year when we had the legends speak, he said racing is too safe today. People don't realize how dangerous it really is. And as someone who's been very close to the danger all these years and picked up too many pieces, I still love the sport. And I love it the way it is meant to be. And that's, we go out, we have to be there within 12 seconds. Because if the car's on fire, you've only got 12 seconds to save his life. That fire suit is only good for 12 seconds in a 57-gallon fuel tank. Gasoline burns pretty hot. At least we can see it. Unlike Indy cars where you can't see the flame, there you can only look for white shirt or white, driver suits that turn brown. Then you know things are bad. Or you look for the heat waves. But that's where we're at, and I'm sure some of you have some questions from our presenters. I'm not going to get into any more detail because, like I say, I don't have any series of notes, but it's all up here.
I'm trying to remember the year that in Montreal that Bobby Rahal drove, and it had an incident on Friday and damaged his car, and the team had a car that was an older car on display downtown in a shopping mall or a hotel lobby, and they had to go get it. Do you remember that story? And he raced that car. They worked all night. Don't you remember that? Yeah, it was. Did he?
I didn't have to go bail. I didn't have to go bail him out, so it wasn't my problem.
I was probably there. I think I've heard the story now that you mention it, but I have no idea what was behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think it was like, did he race twice there or just once? Maybe it's 79.
Definitely once.
Yeah.
And again, I'm hazy on this.
It was with Walter Wolf.
78, because the results I showed.
Yeah.
Down on the field there.
Yeah, it was one of those 2 years, but yeah, the car was damaged heavily, and they had a display car in I think it was a hotel lobby, and they had to go get it and truck it out to the track and change the motor and put a transmission in it, and they worked all night to get him to qualify.
Questions?
The car was in the Jacques Villeneuve Museum, 80 miles up the river, so they had to run to the museum and grab it. It was on display at the museum.
Okay. Questions?
Can you hear me? Okay. What do you think of the updates at Mosport over the years, last couple of years? Guardrails, media center, moving the media center over the wall, the other side of the track, the extension of the pit lane, moving the victory lane circle.
I was there last week for the vintage car race, and there are substantial changes there. As you mentioned, the control tower is now on the outside of the last turn. The presentations are way off at the end of the paddock near turn 1. The turn 2 that goes down and drops off Camber and continues up the hill, if you get through that part of it, has a huge runoff now. The S's coming into the final 90-degree onto the pit straight has been opened up tremendously for people that don't survive the S's. There have been a number of changes over the years, and probably a lot safer. Tunnel was another thing. all came around the S's, and it's a left-hander before you do the right-hander onto the pit straight. His back end came around, and he was 90 degrees faced to the guardrail, right where the tunnel was. And I have a picture, it was way out of focus, but I have this little tiny image going straight up in the air as if it was launching to the moon. The car went over the guardrail and landed upside down beside the tunnel. He survived with, I think, a broken arm. But that tunnel is now widened to 2 cars wide. It used to be 1, and there was one-way traffic at that time.
So my comment, for the first part of your question, they built, the new ownership built new buildings on the outfield side across from the pits. That's primarily for hospitality. They decided that they would make one of the rooms function as a media room. And I know this is inside baseball, but for you and I, it's a disaster. It's a total, you can't see anything, hardly at all. The PA people are there, they can't see anything. If you're going to report on the race other than just off the television screens, you have to get across the little bridge over into the paddock. The podium is another half mile away. It's just a disaster. I'll not give it any other adjective. But it's a disaster. There's other, I think as a hospitality thing, it's probably good. But whoever designed that didn't have a clue when it came to dealing with media. But that's inside baseball. That's you and me.
Was there another question? Did someone have a question? Jump up and down on your left foot.
Yes.
Yes.
Here we go.
I listened to my answer about where the car came from when Ray Hall had the practice crash. I think I'm mistaken. It wouldn't have been a Wolf car in Villeneuve's museum. I'll get back to you.
Any other questions?
Other questions?
I have a question. Did any of you either have conversations at all with Mark Donahue through the years?
Many times.
Got a good story?
Mark used to teach driver's school for us up here with the Glen Region SCCA. He was our open wheel instructor. And so I had a lot of talk with him at various times. I had talked with him at Seneca Lodge for over breakfast a couple of times. He was a very knowledgeable, nice engineer. He didn't understand my theory of full cantilever suspension when I told Tim Mayer how to do it, and he built a car and put Mark in it, and Mark says, "Oh, that's too complicated. We don't have time to figure that out." And that was Mark's only drive for McLaren at Mosport. Or not, yeah, it was at Mosport.
I think it's 71.
Yeah, but he didn't understand the full cantilever suspension, so he put back on the old.
There were a lot of people who were confused about the developments of suspension in those days. The Lola was a disaster, which was also because of its suspension.
But I'm the one who gave it to Tim Mayer.
It sounds like we could really go on for hours, and we're going to, but let me thank these wonderful gentlemen for a terrific presentation. And invite you all to join us back over at the Research Center, where our staff member Sam Baker has prepared some refreshments for you. And these guys will be available for more questions. Thanks very much.